Okay, so I think the recording has begun. Um, Today we're going to talk about housing. So let's start with sort of outlining the terms of the housing crisis that we're sort of living through today in 2020. I guess, a caveat first that this presentation is mostly focused on the San Francisco Bay Area, just because that's the region that I know the most about and feel personally connected to. But I think a lot of these trends and forces and ideas and situations broadly translate to big cities all across the United States and to some extent less urban areas as well. But basically, if we could sum it up in one sentence, for the last 20 years, housing prices have been rising significantly faster than wages, right? So housing is really, really expensive right now. And it also has this feature where it's getting more and more expensive all the time and sort of becoming further and further out of reach for people whose wages are, broadly speaking, not increasing at all, as we learned last week in the speech, whatever. What is the first and most obvious, and I think most visible consequence of this situation is that, thousands and millions of people across the country are falling out of the housing market entirely and living in situations similar to what you see in this picture, which I think is in Oakland. I'm not sure when exactly it was taken. Um, it's truly shocking, I find, just to see it all the time. Breaks your heart, really. And it's also like very, I think it's easy to get used to it if you're seeing it every day. But in 2018, a United Nations representative, I think, came to the San Francisco Bay Area and visited some encampments like this in San Francisco and Oakland, and really classified it as a human rights violation on par with slums that have been seen in like India or Bangladesh or like other places that you might consider the global south. So things are really, really pretty severe in terms of homelessness in our cities. But in addition to the consequences for people who fall out of the housing market, there's also a number of consequences for people who are still in, who can't afford housing at some point. One is long ass commutes. People are living farther and farther away from where they work because jobs are in the cities, but you can't actually afford to live in the city at all. So you live in places like, I don't know, Antioch, Vacaville, Vallejo, and people are spending, 2 hours each way, 2.5 hours each way for a total of like 4 to 5 hours every day in a car and a freeway, which is a disaster for emissions. It's a disaster for lifestyle. Like, it really sucks. There's also a large number of people, an increasing amount of people who are paying more than 50% of their income in rent, and where basically just the growth of housing prices is just feeding into that pie chart of everyone's monthly finances and contributing to general economic precarity, in that many people can't afford a surprise. What's the statistic that I always say? Like, most Americans can't afford a surprise expense of like $500 because every paycheck is just immediately eaten up by rent, and other things. But today we're focusing on the big chunk of that is the cost of housing. And also, a consequence in and of itself is that a greater percentage of the population is renters, right? So home ownership rates are going down, and a higher percentage of the population is actually renters. And so I think uh, to get sort of a theoretical orientation around that consequence, it's important to outline the Marxist argument against landlordism. But, so the first thing to note about landlordism is it's a leftover feudal relation, right? Like, it's the lord of the land, which is like a relation that held over from actually the pre-capitalist times when you had like Lord Stark, right, who like owned all the lands in the north basically, and then all the peasants or the serfs who like would work those lands and turn those lands into productive like food production via farming, would like have to pay back a percentage of their grain to the landlord because they were the lord and for no other reason, right? Um, and it's important to recognize that in this arrangement, the landlord actually creates no value and provides no service, right? So the landlord doesn't do anything. They don't do shit. They don't create any new value. They don't even really provide housing in the sense that the housing exists whether or not the landlord does, right?
Yeah, so uh, yeah, so basically the land, without the feudal landlord, there would be no land from which we could harvest the grain. That's obviously not true. If the landlord went away, the land would still exist. If your landlord went away, your house would still exist because the people who built your house, the construction workers who put in labor in order to produce sort of a new structure, they produced housing and they provided new housing. But the landlord just continues to extract value uh, from something that's already been built and doesn't actually create or provide any new value. So basically, so if they're not providing any new value, what do landlords do? Well, they hold a deed of ownership, which allows them to deny access to pre-existing shelter to those who don't or can't pay a fee, right? So all they really have is a legal relationship to land that excludes you and stops you from using it productively, even though you need it. Um, and furthermore, they expect this deed of ownership and this ability to deny access to be enforced by the state violently, right? Um, and that's evictions, right? That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about evictions, right? Which is a violent process that basically stops you from using pre-existing housing because you can't allow the landlord to continue to extract a portion of your income that you actually earned by creating value in the economy, right? So that's sort of the theoretical Marxist argument against landlordism. And so a true socialist, true communist would probably wants to abolish all landlords. So that's probably the radical position. So getting a little bit away from the theoretical and back more to the particulars of our specific situation here in the United States. The broad historical context is that during the post-war period, the federal government enacted policies to increase home ownership for white people specifically, as a way for them to build wealth, and sort of it was seen as a social goal in and of itself to increase home ownership. They created things like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the housing interest tax credit in order to make it easier for white people to buy homes, but they also wanted to fuck over black people at the same time, so they did redlining. This is a map of San Francisco that's redlined, and basically it was just a legal regime by which housing prices were artificially suppressed in the redline areas, and de jure segregation was enforced to the point where, like, if you were black, you could not buy a house in the sort of non-red areas there. And these maps, it's very interesting wherever you live to look at these maps, because a lot of times these maps still define sort of the neighborhoods and the relations in the cities, even though they haven't been sort of enforced by law for many years. So this general process and this legal framework created a process of suburbanization and white flight, where a lot of white people who had lived inside the cities were moving out into the suburbs and sort of taking their tax dollars with them. And so they would still work in the city, but then they would take the money outside of the city, and it led to sort of disinvestment in the inner city or urban areas. That's where you kind of get the phrase inner city, which I don't think is really a phrase that people use that much anymore, but in this case, it makes sense. It represents the sort of the central city areas that were vacated by white people, which then had racialized black populations, black and brown populations of people who were just didn't really get the same support from the federal government that those white people were. But today, the trend is reversed. So now these formerly disinvested areas are having a lot of influx. More people are moving back into the cities, whether that's because, I mean, I don't think I can really get into exactly why, but people want to be in the cities more now. Maybe you all can tell me why that is. But this process causes an increase in demand in the central city areas for housing from people moving into the cities, right? So that's kind of like I would say that's sort of like the surface level mainstream media explanation of sort of why the housing crisis is happening. Where we have a certain number of houses in our cities, more people are trying to move into the cities. There's too many people, there's not enough houses, prices go up because supply and demand, yada, 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 right? But that sort of construction or that story kind of misses a lot of the other sort of more complex phenomena that are happening in the housing market, which I think can be summarized with the term financialization. So that's something that we sort of talked about a little bit last week with respect to neoliberalism. But in the context of the housing market, what it means is that a lot of rich individuals, investment funds, holding companies are owning or trying to own more and purchasing more luxury housing in major cities specifically, but other kinds of land as well. Primarily as an investment vehicle and a place to park their money where it's going to appreciate over time, right? And to these people, it's important to realize that there's really kind of a fundamental shift in the way that they're looking at the housing itself, right? To them, real estate exists primarily as an investment, as an asset that's going to appreciate. So something where you put money and then it becomes more money, and not as a place to live, right? These are not people who are really residents of the city in a way that you or I would recognize, really. And they don't really care to use the housing to actually shelter people who live in the city. And they don't want it because they need shelter. They want it because for its ability, its speculative future price increase, right? This trend dramatically increased after the 2008 financial crisis, which we could do a whole session, and we may, on. But basically, after 2008, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates extremely low for almost a decade, which the consequence of that is basically that other investments that a person with a lot of money has could consider, like, so besides real estate, like I, rich guy, have $1 million and I want to put it somewhere where it's going to grow. I could put it in a savings account. I could put it, I could buy stocks with it. I could buy bonds. I could buy loans or whatever, loan it out to other people, or I could invest it in real estate. Because the interest rates are so low, all those things that are not housing become less attractive as the returns on investment are low. So for that reason, a lot of rich people have sort of sought shelter for their money in real estate and in housing. And this sort of leads to what is being depicted in this cartoon here, which is the really shocking statistic I find, that in most major cities, including San Francisco and Oakland, there are more vacant units than there are homeless people, right? So like I think in Oakland, it's 4 to 1. There's 4 vacant units for every like unhoused person that is in the city. Obviously it's tough to measure just because like the counts of the unhoused people, like they're very difficult to do. But I think either, any way you look at it, any sort of reasonable analysis shows that there's sort of large numbers of units that are just sitting around empty because it's more profitable for the person who owns the house to leave it empty and just let it appreciate price than it is to actually rent it out or to let somebody use it. Or obviously it's cheaper than to sell it to somebody who actually wants to live there, right? Or who could actually live in the city. So, you're basically keeping people who need houses out of houses for the purpose of capitalism and capital accumulation. And another thing that this introduces, or another feature of the housing market that this kind of explains, is sort of the perpetual increase, right? Is that it's not just that housing is really expensive right now, it's that it gets more and more expensive every year. And that continued growth rate and that kind of like steep line that's going up is the necessary feature for this sort of investment logic to keep occurring. So these people not only want the houses to be very expensive, they want them to continue to increase in price over time in order for them to continue to be making profits. So what does this lead to, right? So this sort of on the ground, and I think we're all kind of familiar with the idea of gentrification. I think Whole Foods is probably like the number one symbolic sort of like representation of that kind of thing. But what is gentrification? It's basically the process of like relatively wealthy white residents moving back into formerly disinvested areas. So I like to refer to it as the destruction of vibes, because like it's when experienced on the ground in a city, it kind of like shows itself as sort of this cultural destruction where you take sort of like something that did exist in a culture of people who are maybe weren't getting as much support from the school system or the federal government or whatever, housing prices were low or whatever, but there were still large communities of people who were responsible for like the best culture that we have in the United States, like, right, like, you know, like hip hop music and all that good stuff. Basically, you know, a vibrant artistic and cultural life in these areas that gets replaced by something that's like sort of corporate and sterile and generic and just lame. But I think that while that cultural argument is compelling and interesting, and I think we all have things to say about it, I think that from a more materialist political standpoint, it's important to focus not necessarily on gentrification, but on displacement. Because displacement is basically what happens to the people who were there before the new stuff comes in, right? So, and I think that that's like sort of the easy thing to lose or to not see, because by the time the gentrifiers get there, the land has already been cleared. So when you displace somebody, you don't see them anymore. You don't see their problems. You know, you don't see the fact that they're probably still in poverty if they were in poverty before or whatever. They're just in poverty in a different place, right? But you think you fixed the neighborhood, you didn't really fix anything. You push these people out somewhere else. And it's important to realize that the process of gentrification is not sort of this gentle or natural or subtle or slow or inevitable thing. It's actually, you need to do a lot of evictions in order to do gentrification. And these evictions are facilitated by law enforcement that are the violent tip of the spear that often clear sort of the land in anticipation of gentrification. I think one example of this that I think is really illustrative of how sort of all of these different problems that we talk about are connected is that the police who killed Breonna Taylor were sort of connected with a real estate and development interest who was had plans to develop and gentrify basically the block that she lived on. And there's a strong statistical relationship between like areas that are being targeted for redevelopment and increased violent police enforcement of any kinds of laws, not just evictions, but also just, you know, drug warrants or whatever, because the police are sort of allied with the property interests in order to sort of clear that land violently and displace those residents in preparation for redevelopment. And it's important to, I think, a good connection to make about this whole process of gentrification is that it's really kind of like part of the long legacy of settler colonialism, right? So yeah, like Christopher Columbus came and gentrified the United States, I guess is what I'm saying. No, not really, but basically it's this idea that you're coming to this new land and these sort of white settlers are sort of pioneering new neighborhoods or whatever, and that, you know, they're sort of like, you came to this land and this land was empty, right? Like this neighborhood didn't have anything in it, nothing was going for it. But it's like, that's not true at all. There was 100 million people who lived in the Americas before Christopher Columbus got there, and there was like thousands of millions of people who lived in gentrified neighborhoods before they were gentrified, right? And so I think it's pretty obvious that there's a connection there. And I think just in general, when I think about gentrification, I think it's important to just think about money and people, right? Because it's not necessarily a bad thing that more money and more investment is going into areas that had lacked investment in the past, right? Like, it's not a bad thing if you fix up the parks in a neighborhood or, you know, do this, plant more trees, whatever, you know, those things could be seen as gentrification, but those things I think are broadly good things, right? Like trees, I like trees, right? They make cities more livable. But the question is who is that stuff for, right? Because if you do it in order to clear residents out and replace them with new residents, then that's bullshit, right? But if you're putting money in to a community, it actually has to, you have to show me, if you're doing something like that, that it actually benefits the people who were there before, right? The people who need it the most. And so now that we sort of understand the problem a little bit, I think it's very important, especially in terms of urban politics, to understand these two terms, which are NIMBY and YIMBY. So these represent sort of two factions of, I don't know if you might call it housing Twitter, or it's not just on Twitter. These are really existing factions in local politics and urban politics. But these are sort of two groups of people or broad ideologies that sort of exist with respect to housing. Because, well, especially in large democratic controlled cities, nobody doesn't think this is a problem, right? Like everybody understands that this is a problem. It's just, what is your prescription to solve it? And what are your priorities in the way that you go about trying to solve it, right? So a NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. And these are typically existing homeowners who oppose new development. They don't want to see new buildings come into their neighborhood. They typically cite like lifestyle or quality of life concerns. The I guess the canonical example in San Francisco that gets talked about is that like NIMBYs don't want to change the zoning rules in San Francisco because most of the zoning rules stipulate that in a lot of the neighborhoods you can't build above 3 stories. And people don't want you to build more than 3 stories because it'll ruin their beautiful view of the Golden Gate Bridge. But so yeah, but you can really kind of think of these people as modern segregationists, right? Because their opposition to having new people or building new development, or especially building affordable housing in their area, really comes from a desire to like keep other people, poor people, out of their neighborhoods and of their areas, because they see those people as less desirable, and often that is really just a proxy for racism. So NIMBYs are bad. Lots of people think NIMBYs are bad, but they still are sort of a real force in a lot of urban politics, as represented by like local homeowners and stuff like that. The next faction is a little bit more subtle. It's called YIMBYs, or Yes in My Backyard. So it's kind of a silly acronym, but basically these are people who really support a lot of new market rate development. This building, I think it's just super ugly. They're tall. They have all these generic units. If you've been inside one of them, they all have like these labyrinthine hallways, and like there's probably a lot of amenities like a gym or whatever. And it's basically all market rate, and it's basically only for like tech people, and it doesn't really serve the need for affordable housing at all. They support upzoning, so they'll often say a lot of things about like, yeah, repeal that ban so that we can build a bunch of high rises. Because basically their solution to the problem is like build a bunch of high rises full of like these people are often allied with the large real estate interests, right? So the people who make a lot of money by building large high rises are definitely supporting of the YIMBYs and are in the YIMBY camp. Right? All of these developments are like huge deals. Donald Trump is like a real estate guy, right? Like there's a lot of like real estate guys like in this kind of camp. And so the YIMBY, I mean, so I guess the next thing that I want to talk about here is sort of like debunking the YIMBY philosophy and sort of understanding why that solution of just building a bunch of high rises, which include market rate housing, like probably isn't actually going to work to solve our problem, right? So those people sort of believe that the housing market is really just a simple supply and demand situation, right? And that if you increase the housing supply in any way, prices will go down and everybody will benefit from that. But the truth is that housing market is actually, I'll just skip ahead. The housing market, as it really functions, is actually divided into several semi-independent sub-markets. So basically, there's like kind of a market for luxury housing, a luxury for high-cost housing, a market for middle-income housing, and so on and so forth. And those markets like don't really interact with each other as much as you might imagine, right? So I guess the idea with the YIMBYs is that if you add one more unit of luxury housing, then it'll obviously make the luxury market less tight, but then someone else from the high cost market will go up into the luxury market, and then that will open up another unit in the high cost market, and actually it will benefit the high cost market as well. But the truth is that those effects, those knock-on effects on the adjacent markets are very like diminishing, to the point where adding new luxury units actually doesn't really affect the very low-cost units in the very low-cost market in any way at all, because those kinds of units just aren't the kinds of units that like low-income people are going to ever consider moving into, right? Because of a number of reasons, and just because of the way the housing works. And so, I mean, yeah, so I mean, I guess the upshot of this is that the sort of like Econ 101 argument that we just need to increase the housing supply and we just need to build more doesn't make any sense unless you like really focus that new housing at the people who need it the most. So if that's a bad solution, what is like a good solution to the housing problem? I would suggest social and public housing. Basically, you need large amounts of housing units that are not subject to the free market in any way at all, right? And that also includes rent control. But I think really what it means is getting a lot more units of just completely affordable housing that is free if it comes to it, right? If you can't really afford anything, that housing should still be a human right. The government should provide that for its citizens. Social and public housing would be owned by the state or by the residents. But it's important to also remember that this has been tried in the past, and that during the war on poverty, they had the large housing projects, and it didn't go so well. So it's important to remember how it was done and do it better next time. Vacancy tax is another idea to make it very bad for people to have these empty units sitting around. That was kind of like the picture here is from the Moms for Housing, which was the four moms who just sort of took over a house that was owned by some like investment company that had been vacant for 2 years because they believe that housing is a human right and that they should be able to live in the empty house. Positive, modern, holistic, beautiful, inclusive urban planning. That's a lot of adjectives, but it's just to say that building new housing will be part of the solution. But it's important for us to, as we decide to build new housing, to center the needs of our most vulnerable and think about urban planning holistically in a way that incorporates the needs of like transportation and sort of like food deserts and stuff, like just to basically design our beautiful cities the way we want them to be. Yeah. And of course, the most extreme position that you could probably have is that we should ban landlordism and redistribute housing. Uh, our good friend Chairman Mao, basically at the end of the Chinese Civil War in the late 1940s, basically as part of his revolutionary communist project, he rounded up probably about 1 million landlords and killed them all and redistributed the land to the peasants and the citizens who have been working that land and farming it. So I'm not saying we should do that, but I would say that that is probably the most extreme leftist solution to this problem that could be considered. So what are the key takeaways? One, learn to spot a yimby, right? So I think one thing about San Francisco politics that can become very confusing is that it's all Democrats, and it's very difficult sometimes to tell a good Democrat and a bad Democrat. But one easy way, like the issue of housing is often the issue that really divides a lot of these people. And one way to tell like if they're a good Democrat or a bad Democrat is if you get those mailers and at the bottom of the mailer it says supported by California Realtors Association or supported by the California Apartment Association, whatever. Those are the people who are making the most money off of the housing situation that we have now, where everything is extremely expensive. So it's really not in their interest to do something that would actually reduce the cost of housing in a meaningful way. I like to say the principle of cui bono, which I think it's a Latin phrase or something, but it's like if you want to solve a crime, if some husband got murdered or whatever, you say cui bono, who benefits? Who benefited from this guy getting murdered? You say, oh, his wife got a bunch of life insurance money. Well, then you're gonna look at her and say, well, maybe she did the murder, but she benefited, right? So who benefits from the housing situation that we have now? Who benefits from a situation where housing prices are like extremely, extremely expensive and unreachable for a lot of people? Well, it's the real estate developers and the landlords and stuff like that. So even though those people may say that they support building more housing or this or that, they don't really have the same interests as you are. The market cannot solve this problem, right? Like I think it's very obvious that if we leave the market to decide, thousands and millions of people will be unhoused, and that is a morally unconscionable situation. We need to have the courage to say that's not okay, and the market can't solve this. And rent is bullshit. Remember that your landlord is stealing from you all the time. Every time you pay rent, your landlord is stealing from you. Yeah, so that's all I have for the slides. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording.